Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you from a very chill and cold South Africa. Sorry for the delay for everybody that's online. Unfortunately, we've got load shedding in South Africa, so that means that everything else is effective and affected. I'm going to just start, and I'm going to give you the outline for the discussion, and then I'm going to hand over to each participant. If you need any information on every speaker, I will give it later in the debate. But just because of time restraints and the possibility of the power going off again at 12, I really want to get the guys to get going before then. So just to give you a little bit of an outline of the format, we're going to give each speaker a 25-minute introduction each. There's going to be a 12-minute rebuttal from each side. Then there will be a 15-minute cross-examination to each speaker. And then there will be a 3-minute closing statement that will be made from each participant. So, as you know, today's discussion centers around the Satanic Verses. Obviously, one of the most controversial books in recent literary history was Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, which I think was published almost 3 decades ago already. It is due for us to speak on these topics, obviously to give a basic and good account and a very deep perspective from both sides, both a Christian and a Muslim one. So without any delay, I just quickly want to introduce the speakers. Again, Samuel Green is here online all the way from Australia. Thank you for being here, Samuel. Always good to have you on.
Thank you.
Again, if you need any information from Samuel, he's got a website called engagingwithislam.org, and you can find a lot of material, a lot of written material, and a lot of tracts, etc., on that website. The other participant is also a friend, Yusuf Ismail. He's an advocate all the way from South Africa. He hails from KwaZulu-Natal, which we are jealous about, but we won't say it if we're in Johannesburg. But you are welcome to find information of Yusuf Ismail on the ipci.co.za site. And in doing so, you can get a lot of his debates. Materials are online as well. And as a result of that, obviously, you can have a look at that, and you are welcome to engage with Yusuf through that platform as well. Without any delay, gentlemen, I'm going to hand over to Samuel to start with his opening statement. Samuel, you've got 25 minutes. As soon as you start to speak, I will start the clock. And again, well done that you are here with us all the way from Australia. We won't bring up cricket or rugby, but you are welcome to start. And as soon as I hear your voice, I will start your 25 minutes.
Okay, well, it's great to be with everyone today as we look at this important subject. And I want to thank Rudolph for organising this and Yusuf for being part of this discussion. The topic today is the Satanic Verses, a historical or fictional incident. And I guess for many people watching this, you may not even be aware of what these Satanic Verses refer to. You may be quite aware or you may not be. But today I'm going to be, I hope that this debate will be helpful for you in this regard and give you some insight as to what this issue is. And I'm going to be arguing that the Satanic Verses are, in fact, a real event in history. Now, the structure, come down here, come on. Why isn't my structure working? Go down. Okay, so the structure of my talk is going to be, I'm going to look at what are the Satanic Verses and why they matter, the historical basis for the event, why Orthodox Islam rejects the event, and the Muslim desire for a righteous man. So let's get straight into this. Now, my screen's not working there, so I'll see if this works. No? Okay, I'll have to use this. Okay, so what are the Satanic Verses and why do they matter? Well, it's a time when Muhammad recited as part of the Quran that the gods of Mecca were valid. In Islamic history, this is known as the story of the cranes, and historically, it's the reason why the Muslim refugees returned from Abyssinia. And I've given you some of the main references to the Satanic Verses. Ibn Ishaq's one of the older ones, but these are the ones where if you wanted to read it, you could read it yourself. I'll just give a quick summary. When you read these events, you see that it begins with Muhammad desiring that the Meccans will accept him as a prophet. And he's anxious to find a way to do this. So he's desiring and he's anxious to find a way to do this. And then one day, while he's reciting Surah 53, and Surah 53 is actually quite critical of the gods of Mecca. However, one day when he's reciting it, he came to the part which was critical of the gods of Mecca, where it said, have you thought of Al-Lat, where is it? Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, the third of these. But instead of rejecting these gods, he accepted them and said that these are the exalted cranes, that is, birds who fly up in the air, who up near God, whose intercession is approved. Now, we read that when the Quraysh, that is the Meccans, heard this, they were delighted, and were greatly pleased at the way he spoke of their gods, and they listened to him. Then the people dispersed, and the Meccans, the Quraysh, went out delighted at what had been said about their gods, saying, Muhammad has spoken of our gods in splendid fashion. Now, what happens is that after this, after Muhammad says this, the Meccans then join in worship, in prostration with Muhammad. And the Muslim refugees, when they hear about this, begin to come back from Abyssinia. However, we read that the angel Gabriel came to the apostle and said, what have you done, Muhammad? You have read to these people something I did not bring you from God, and you have said what he did not say to you. And then we have Muhammad saying, so Muhammad then confesses. He goes, I ascribe to Allah what he had not said. I have fabricated things against God and have imputed to him words which he has not spoken. And so these are, and then we're told that these are the words that were motivated by the actions of Satan working on Muhammad's desires. And then after this, Muhammad removes these verses from his recitation. Now, why does it matter? Well, it matters because Muhammad has been preaching monotheism, and now he's seriously compromised that. It also matters because Muslims say Muhammad is the perfect model, and so you should follow him in everything. And it also matters because if Muhammad could not tell the difference between Satan's inspiration to him, Satan's working on his desires, and the angel, then what assurance do we have for the rest of the Quran? Well, I want to look at the historical basis for this. And I want to actually say that it's overwhelming. The amount of evidence we've got for this is overwhelming. Shahab Ahmed is the main Islamic scholar in this area, and I just want to read a few of his quotes. He says, the Satanic Verses incident is narrated in numerous reports between 18 and 25, depending upon how one reckons an independent riwayah, scattered in the Sirah, Nabiyya, and the Tafsir literature in the first 2 centuries of Islam, indicating that the incident formed a fairly standard element in the historical memory of the early Muslim community regarding the life of its founder. And then the next quote, we have repeatedly dated the reports of the Satanic Verses incident to the late 1st and early 2nd centuries. In other words, to what seems to have been the earliest period of systematic collection and organisation of historical memory material in the Muslim community. As regard the discourses of which these reports formed a part, we have found that all the reports are transmitted by late 1st century, early 2nd century Sirah, Maghazi, and Tafsir scholars. And then his next point I want to bring up, the Satanic Verses were being transmitted in almost every important intellectual centre in the Dar al-Islam, that is in the domain of Islam, in Medina, Mecca, Basra, Kufa, Baghdad, Misisiya, Ray, Balkh, Samarkand, Sana, Fustat, and Kayran. And so I just want to make some observations with this. When we're talking about the Satanic Verses, it's not just Salman Rushdie's book. These are actually the accounts of Muhammad's life from the earliest sources, from actually the time when Muslims started writing their history. That's where we find these accounts. And it's in the biographies and in the military campaigns and in the commentary. So it's in across all of the literature. And it's many different sources. There's 37 different reports that Shahab gives in his book. And the way when you look at those reports and the chains that go with them, showing where they come from, we can see that they're independent reports in what historians would call multiple attestation. That is, there are multiple people independent of each other telling the same thing. And every major Islamic center was transmitting this story. And it's just part of how the early Muslims told the life of Muhammad. Now, in terms of the criteria of embarrassment, this is a criteria that historians use, where if something's embarrassing, it wouldn't be invented. And it's hard to think of why the early Muslims would invent a story of Muhammad compromising his monotheism. It just doesn't make sense. The only reason they would be passing it on is that that's just what happened. I want to say that the Satanic Verses, or the story of the cranes, when we look at the Islamic sources, because of the independent sources we've got, the multiple attestation, the number of sources, all of these things, when we bring them together, the early date, it is beyond reasonable doubt. It's historically overwhelming, and there is no reason to reject this account of Muhammad's life. Now, however, in spite of this overwhelming historical evidence in the Islamic sources, Orthodox Islam rejects the Satanic Verses as a fictitious event and a made-up story. And in the study Quran, in pages 841 and 1292, they give 5 reasons for why Orthodox Islam doesn't accept them. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to quickly go through these, and I'm going to look at each reason and show how they're not valid, and then I'll explain the real reason why Orthodox Islam rejects the Satanic Verses. So let's look at the first of these. The first reason is that they say it's contradictory accounts. They're confusing accounts. Now, I've read the 37 accounts in Shahab's work on this, and they're actually not contradictory. They're highly similar. They all have exactly the same basic elements, and they're clearly referring to the same event. So that's just not true to say they're contradictory. The second reason they give is that, well, it's out of character. It's not something that Muhammad would do. But I want to say it's completely consistent with what Muhammad would do. And I'm going to give a few examples. Let's look at the first of these about how Muhammad composed the Quran. So you'll see here this hadith about how he composed it. Narrated al-Bara, there was revealed, not equal are those believers who sit at home and those who strive and fight in the cause of Allah. The Prophet said, call Zayd for me and let him bring the board and the inkpot and the scapular bone. Then he said, right, not equal are those believers who sit. And at that time, Amir bin Maktam, the blind man, was sitting behind the Prophet. He said, O Allah's apostle, what is your order for me as regards to the above verse, as I am a blind man? So instead of the above verse, the following verse was revealed. Not equal are those believers who sit at home, except those who are disabled and those who strive and fight in Allah's cause. Now you can see that you've got the verse is said at an early stage up here in 949, and then a blind man says, hang on, I can't fight. I can't go and fight. How is this verse fair to me? And so you see down here that Muhammad then recites it with, except those who are disabled. And so we see that Muhammad was composing the Quran in response to how it was received by people. And that's completely consistent with the Satanic Verses. Next, we see that it's consistent, Muhammad's character is consistent with the Satanic Verses because his desires often shaped the content of the Quran. This is narrated al-Bara. The Prophet prayed facing Beit al-Maqdis, that is Jerusalem, for 16 or 17 months. But he wished that his Qibla, that is his direction of prayer, would be at the Kaaba in Mecca. So Allah revealed chapter 2, verse 144, and he offered the Ansar prayer in his mosque facing Mecca. And so you see how Muhammad desired for the direction of the change of prayer, and then a verse comes from Allah saying that. In fact, we have Muhammad's desires reported by his wife, one of his wives, where she says, narrated Aisha, I said to the Prophet, I feel that your Lord hastens in fulfilling your wishes and desires. The final one I'll look at is how Muhammad incorporated as much of the Meccan religion as he could to make it easy for the Meccans to accept him. So this is narrated Zayd bin Aslam from his father, who said Umar bin al-Katabi addressed the corner, that is the black stone, saying, by Allah, I know that you are a stone and can neither benefit nor harm. Had I not seen the Prophet touching and kissing you, I would never have touched and kissed you. Then he kissed it and said, "There is no reason for us to do Ramal and Tawaf except that we wanted to show off before the pagans, and now Allah has destroyed them." Umar added, "Nevertheless, the Prophet did that, and we do not want to leave it." Now here we have Umar being very uncomfortable about having to continue the pre-Muslim practice of kissing and honouring the black stone because it was part of their idolatrous worship. But you see how Muhammad was actually prepared to take this on and continue this practice in order to make it easy for the Meccans to receive him. And thus, Muhammad's methodology was to incorporate as much of the pre-Islamic religion as possible to make the Meccans accept him. And so the Satanic Verses fit perfectly into the character of Muhammad here. Now, the next reason that people say the Satanic Verses aren't genuine is because of chronology. They say that it doesn't fit in with surahs 17 and 22, but these surahs are not meant to be actually part of it. They're explaining it from other parts of the Quran, and this often happens. Another reason is that people have said, well, Satan doesn't have this type of power over a prophet. Allah wouldn't let this happen to a prophet. But I want to say, of course he does. Satan, and just think about the story in the Quran of Adam. Adam is a prophet, but Adam listened to Satan. Adam acted on what Satan said, and then Adam repented after listening to Satan. And this is consistent with the event of the Satanic Verses where Muhammad listens to Satan and acts upon it and then later repents. Now, the final point I want to look at is that the Satanic Verses comes from unreliable sources. And the claim here is that the chains of narration, that is, who told who about these stories, are faulty. They're untrustworthy. They've got gaps in them. Now, Shahab Ahmed discusses this. He goes, during the course of this analysis of all the different 37 narrations, he says, we have only had one occasion to conclude that an isnad was perhaps not to be taken at face value. So he actually finds the isnads quite reliable. He says, now, there are some gaps within the chains, absolutely, but the sheer number of independent narrations going back to the same original narrator means that those gaps in the chains can be compensated for and tested. Now, yes, there are a few gaps in the chains, but they can be tested. I've already said that. And so I want to say there's actually no reason to reject these chains. Now, often it's said that the chain is a guarantee, but and Muslims will do the work with these chains, looking at who told who, and they will test each person to make sure that they're reliable. Now, I can hear voices coming through here, so maybe that needs to be turned off. But one of the things you'll notice is that different Muslim groups accept different hadiths depending upon their methodology, even though they may have a reliable chain. And so if you get familiar with Islam, you'll know that what stories you choose and what you reject can vary from Muslim group to Muslim group. And they have their preferred narrators, and they work it out not just according to who the narrators are, but also according to their doctrine. In fact, if you want to say that that having an unreliable narrator in a chain makes it unworthy, then you've actually got to get rid of the Quran, because the Quran that is often used, I haven't got that, this Quran here that is often used, which is the Hafs transmission, this is the main Quran. It's actually narrated by Imam Hafs, and in his collection of hadith, Imam Muslim talks about Imam Hafs. There's his name there, Sulaiman bin Mar, which is Imam Hafs, and he says about why he doesn't use Imam Hafs traditions, and he says that people like Imam Hafs have been accused of inventing the forged traditions and creating false news. And so if you're going to get rid of a chain of narration or try to throw doubt over it, then you've got, because of one person, and not worry about the whole picture of all the chains of narration, then you need to be looking at the Quran as well. Now, I also want to say that some great Islamic scholars fully accept the chains, fully accept these Satanic Verses. So Ibn Taymiyyah, who's one of the great Islamic scholars and reformers, I'll just read about how he accepted them. It says, Ibn Taymiyyah, against the majoritarian opinion of the scholars of his day, accepted the historicity of the Satanic Verses as something wholly consonant with Muhammad's status and mission as the messenger of God. He asserted that the belief in the incident was the position of early Muslims, the Salaf, and thus the original and authentic truth. And again, I just want to point out there is no reason at all to reject this event in Muhammad's life. Now, Orthodox Islam rejects the Satanic Verses not on historical grounds, but because of its developed doctrines in the 3rd to 6th centuries. Now, this is the idea that the prophets were protected from sin. But this idea develops later in Islam's history, this doctrine, and then it's used as a basis for editing Islamic history and determining what will be genuine history and what can be acceptable history. And I want to look at an example of how the history of the Satanic Verses has been edited. Now, as I've showed you already, in Ibn Ishaq's book on Muhammad's life, which is one of the very earliest ones, if not the earliest ones, he records the Satanic Verses. But Ibn Ishaq had a student called Ibn Hisham, and Ibn Hisham writes his own account of Muhammad's life, and this is what he writes up here as to his methodology. He says, "God willing, I shall begin this book of the Prophet's biography and omitting some of the things which Ibn Ishaq has recorded in his book, things which it is disgraceful to discuss, matters which would distress certain people." So you see, he's actually saying that he's read Ibn Ishaq's book, but what he's not going to pass on are things that are distressing or might seem disgraceful. And so when we read Ibn Ishaq's book, and I've got it here, you can see it there. Ibn Hisham's book, there's no Satanic Verses in it. So the Satanic Verses are in his teacher's book, but when the student makes the book, because of this development in theology that the prophets can't sin, we find that it's taken out. And when it comes to hadiths, we read from a man who explains the hadiths that traditions containing certain remarks of the prophets as may not be part of his prophetic vocation or such expressions as are clearly unsuitable for him should be rejected. So my point here is that Muslims don't just reject hadiths because of the chains of narration. You can have a perfectly good chain of narration, but if it's not suitable, if it doesn't fit in to what Muhammad should be like, if it's disgraceful or something, then it's rejected. Now, I want to suggest to you that that is not how you do history. You don't just do history of good sources by rejecting the good sources because it's disgraceful or it doesn't fit in or it's not suitable. I want to particularly look now at how Imam Bukhari records the Satanic Verses. So you see, he narrated Ibn Abbas. The prophet prostrated while reciting An-Najm, which is Surah 53, which is what we read about before. And with him prostrated the Muslims, the pagans, the jinns, and all human beings. And so you see how Imam Bukhari, he really reflects that view of, he's really culled it right down. He's sanitized the original story. So it has Muhammad reciting Surah 53. It has everybody prostrating, even the unbelievers prostrating and worshipping with him, but it doesn't give us any of the details. And so you can see how he's sanitized it and edited down the story to make it, to improve Muhammad and to have Muhammad fit into Islamic doctrine. Now, I want to finish up with my last point, and I'll just speak to the camera now for this last point, please. In fact, I can stop my screen share. But my last point is to look at the Muslim desire for a righteous man. And what I want to say here is, as you can see, that while Orthodox Islam says it rejects the Satanic Verses because of contradiction, it doesn't fit Muhammad's character, chronology, the Satan doesn't have that type of power, or the sources are unreliable, that really none of these are the actual reasons for rejecting the Satanic Verses. The only reasons they reject them is because Islam developed a new theology of the protection of the prophets, and the Satanic Verses event didn't fit in with that. That's why they're rejected, not on historical grounds, but because of later doctrine. Now, while it's wrong to ignore history, I can understand why Muslims do this, and I can understand why people do this with our leaders. It's because we want our leaders to be a good example for us. The problem is that Muhammad is a person like us, and we all fail. You fail, and I fail. Muhammad certainly did preach monotheism, but as we have seen, on one occasion, he didn't practice what he preached. We all fail. Muhammad is not perfect, and he needed forgiveness. Let me just read to you from Surah 47, verse 19. It says, "So know, O Muhammad, that there is no Allah save Allah, and ask forgiveness for your sin and for believing men and believing women." You see, if you put your hope in Muhammad, you will not be satisfied because he is like us. He needs to be forgiven like us. He needs to be saved like us. The only one who can save us, the only one who has never sinned, is Jesus. God, through Jesus, perfected our humanity. Jesus is the perfect servant of God. He is the perfect Messiah, the perfect priest, the perfect sacrifice. And through him, we can have the perfect worship of God. Our desire for perfection before God is a good thing. But the only way we're going to have this filled is by coming to Jesus. He is the one that you should desire. He is the one who will not let you down. So to finish, I'll just go over what I've done today. I've looked at what are the satanic verses and what they matter, and they do matter. I've looked at the historical basis for them, and we've seen that it's overwhelming and there's no reason to doubt. We've looked at why the Orthodox Islam rejects them, but that really the only reason they're rejected is because of a later doctrine that has developed about the prophets being protected and not sinning, but that this just doesn't match up with history. And then we've seen that it is, in fact, a true historical event, but it points us to something very important to us, something in our heart that we want. We want to be perfect before God. We want that man who can lead us in that true worship. Muhammad is not that man. The true man who can lead us in the true worship of God is Jesus Christ. And it's him that I ask you to put your faith in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samuel. You've got 30 seconds left, which is good timing on your part. Yusuf, over to you. 25 minutes. I'll start the clock as soon as you start speaking. No problem.
Okay, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. I seek protection in God from Satan, the accursed. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Qala rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Sadaqallahu azim. Well, thank you again, Samuel. And this is a topic that I essentially proposed, and I wanted to break some of the stereotypes. And so you've given me a wonderful opportunity, Samuel, to basically address some of these misconceptions and stereotypes which have been used by Christian polemicists and, of course, missionaries over the particular years. Now, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with these so-called pre-Islamic goddesses, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, that are mentioned in Islamic history. Allat was a so-called daughter of Allah, along with the two other goddesses, Al-Uzza and Manat. And essentially, you've pointed this out, the summary of the satanic, in Surah 53, you read the expression, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاةَ الثَّالِثَةَ الْأُخْرَى ومناة الثالثة الأخرى ألكم الذكر ولو أنثى تلك إذن قسمة ضيزى. That have you considered Lat and Uzza and Manat the third? What for you the male and for him the female? Most certainly this is an unfair division. So in other words, a sarcastic, cynical condemnation in relation to these particular goddesses. But the summary of the satanic verses, which Samuel has essentially told us quite articulately at the introduction, is that you had a situation where well, at the outset, let's just start off with this. The satanic verses, it's an Orientalist defamatory term. There's no term called the satanic verses. Samuel should have mentioned this to us. The whole saga in the hadith literature is known as the hadith of the Gharanik al-Ula, Gharanik meaning crane. Islamic sources are not responsible for this. This was coined by a missionary by the name of William Mere, an Orientalist English missionary who fashioned the term satanic verses. The question that missionaries and Islamophobes basically run away and not answer is, number one, looking at the source of the story, Samuel attempted to present some degree of source. Is it mentioned in the Quran? Clearly, we've seen it hasn't. Are there any hadiths which mention any of this information? And why do all the reports contradict each other, which is what Samuel attempted to allude to, but he said it doesn't make any significant problem. Now, the hermeneutical issues, obviously, is did the Prophet utter it? Why did the Prophet utter it? Did the Prophet realize on his own that he erred or was corrected by Jibreel? And why does not a single riwayah mention the story? Now, Samuel mentioned 37 and he alluded to the book by Shahab Ahmad. But, you know, with all respect, and I don't say it to you, but you have to keep up with the latest research. This is Shahab Ahmad's book from 2015, and he's late now, but he narrates something like 50. And his particular perspective has somewhat changed, but we're going to unpack that as we go along. Essentially, the background is that the first batch of Muslim immigrants migrated to Abyssinia. They apparently temporarily returned to Mecca based on the rumor of a compromise between the Quraysh and the Prophet. And what you find is that At-Tabari, Al-Waqidi, and some others reproduce a report in which there's a dozen different versions, and there are many chains of narrations which in effect state that as a result of the compromise, they essentially returned, and basically the increasing enmity then continued after the compromise was not fulfilled. Now, according to the story, the Prophet had been engaging in the recitation of Surah 53. Have you considered Lat, Uzza, and Manat, the third one? And then Satan caused him to recite the words, Tilk al-gharanik al-ula wa inna shafa'atuhunna la turja. That these are the beautiful high-ranking birds. Surely the intercession is anticipated. Gharanik, something which the pagans never referred to, Gharanik. And then after that, according to the story, which Samuel has to address, is that there were two verses, Surah 17, verse 73, and Surah 22, verse 52, which were revealed to rebuke the Prophet and to, in fact, reassure the Prophet. And as a result of that, the Quraysh then subsequently became angry and renewed the enmity, and the opposition increased with vehemence. And then news of the prostration of the incident reached Abyssinia in the form of a rumor. And when they came back, they realized that this was not entirely true. Now, these were the two verses which were said to have canceled the Satanic Verses, Surah 17 and Surah 22, verse 52. Now, I want people to follow through because we're going to get technical in some of these issues that we are going to basically raise. Let's go to the source. The source for this, one of the sources at least, is Ibn Jarir Tabari. Now, if you look at Tabari at the outset, this is the disclaimer he's got. Now, I'm going to translate it in English. He basically says, let him who examines this book of mine know that I have, in fact, information I've mentioned therein which I stipulated to be accurate. But if I mention in this book a report, some men of the past may find essentially objectionable, and which the reader basically finds objectionable or worthy of censure because he sees no aspect of truth, no any factual substance to it. Let him who know that this is not to be attributed to us, but to those who transmitted it. So Tabari was a chronicler. He was not a producer of the narrative. He was a chronicler. You've got the same thing in Kitab al-Tabakat al-Kabir by Ibn Sa'd. And neither al-Tabari or Ibn Sa'd, Samuel, are in fact responsible for producing these particular stories. I think it's important they're chroniclers. If you look at Tarif Khalidi's book, Arabic Historical Thought in Classical Work, he basically states that it is clear that Waqidi is in fact the senior partner. Ibn Sa'd is known as the secretary of Waqidi, and Waqidi was the collator of this Maghazi literature, was attacked for the loose isnad, chain of narration usage by the strict practitioners of hadith. All the major classical scholars, all of the major classical scholars, and I'm going to deal with Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Hajar, rejected. Imam Razi, for example, in his commentary states that the hadith scholars have found the story to be weak. Ibn Khuzaymah was asked regarding the story, declared it to be from heretics in Fakhruddin Razi. Ibn Hazm declared the Satanic Verses story as a forgery and not reliable. Ibn Hajar admits himself that not all accepts mursal narrations. And I'm going to ask Samuel to unpack what he means and understands by mursal narrations. Imam Muslim, who is cited in his introduction to Sahih Muslim, said that mursal narrations cannot be held authoritative, and Ibn Salah says the same thing. So the question missionaries need to ask is that in accepting this particular narrative, the question I need to ask Samuel is what objective scientific and historical methodology are they utilizing for insisting that the version of the story that it appeals to is correct? Sorry, there's a lot of disturbances around me. In the context of what literary genres or cultural products or projects were narratives transmitted, and what were the mechanisms and practices by which they were transmitted? Now, Samuel hasn't addressed this. He's basically gone with the so-called conventional view, but hasn't addressed this specifically, and I'm going to ask him to deal with this in the rebuttal session. The second set of questions is that, are there any eyewitness testimony reports? You see, we hold a higher standard. In the previous debate, I said there's no eyewitness testimony for the New Testament. What are the eyewitness testimony reports to the Satanic Verses? Are there any? Are there any authentic reports, Sahih reports? And this is a question that Samuel has to deal with. If you look at the Sihah Sitta, all the 6 major collections of hadith, none of them, not one, actually mentions the Satanic verses. None of them mention the Satanic verses. If you, for example, look at the Quranic evidence against the Satanic verses, Surah 60 verse 4, if he, the messenger, were to invent any saying in our name, surely we would have seized him by the right hand, we would have cut off the artery. Surah 10 verse 15, it's not of my own accord to change it. Surah 41 verse 42, no falsehood can approach it from the front nor from behind. It is sent down from Allah. Surah 25 verse 32, we make your heart thereby, we dictate it in stages. So there's Quranic evidence against Satanic verses. The Sihah Sitta, the major collections, none of them contain it. Even Bukhari has this particular narrative, which Samuel alluded to, which doesn't contain the Satanic verses. But essentially, what happens is that in a broad sense, Bukhari does not contain it. Bukhari has this particular event in Surah Al-Najm, Surah 53. But essentially, what basically happens is that it doesn't narrate the Satanic verses. We're going to deal with that in the rebuttal session if I have the time. The Satanic verses violates the Quran at a fundamental level. The alleged interpretation violated the principle of Tawheed. He shall under no circumstances forgive Allah. Professor Muhammad Muhar Ali in Sirat al-Nabi and the Orientalists. And the story is found totally unworthy of any kind of credence. The story violates the Quranic precepts at a number of levels. For example, the Quran says it was the unbelievers who made the attempt at inducing the Prophet. The story says that the Prophet made the compromise. The Quran says that the Prophet is immune from compromise. The story says that the Prophet was not immune from compromise and even made a fundamental error. When did the incident take place? I think this is most important. Samuel glossed over this in his narration about the chronological sequence. It established that this happened in the month of Rajab. That's during the month of Shawwal. And if the story is to be connected with this, the incident narrated must have taken place before the month of Shawwal, or maybe in Ramadan of that particular year. But Surah Bani Israel and Surah Al-Hajj, those 2 surahs in the beginning, which are said to rebuke the Prophet, which are said to censure the Prophet, actually took place several years later. According to all accounts, Surah Hajj was revealed in the first year of the Hijrah. Surah Bani Israel was revealed during the time of the Mi'raj. So here's a problem that I've got, is that does the Satanic verses stand up to chronological integrity? Because those riwayas which narrate the Satanic verses narrate these 2 verses as rebuking the Prophet after having narrated them. And the 2 verses which were said to rebuke the Prophet were revealed historically several years later after the alleged Satanic verses. These 2 verses on my right, 1725 and 1772 and 2252. Now, here's my question. It's a straining incredulity to believe, if we had to go ahead with the Satanic verses narrative, that the Prophet would reveal the Satanic verses. This would have an indelible impression in the mind of the Sahaba. And then several years later, you'd have the verses which were said to rebuke him in accordance with the riwayas that happened much, much later. How does it stand up to chronological integrity? Help me here. I mean, the alleged disapproval of the Prophet's allegation was made 5 years after its commission, whilst a notice of repeal was given basically during the first year of the Hijrah. I mean, no one can accept this kind of absurd explanation. Reductio ad absurdum. Alternatively, if it is assumed that the passages in question were each separately from the context of the Satanic verses, but here's the problem. The riwayah mentioned 22 verse 52 and 17 as rebuking the Prophet, but those verses historically were revealed several years later. So how can the Satanic verses, according to riwayah, was just intermittent, but those verses which were said to rebuke him were revealed much, much later. So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit in chronologically. Other question which Samuel, I want him to deal with, why were the Satanic verses not incorporated in Surah Hajj? How come they were kept separately for such a long time? And so the point is that the storytellers have forcibly and unnaturally attempted to fit the passages in the story. And that's essentially what Christian polemicists rely upon. Now, generally speaking, Samuel and others like him within the polemical discourse that they operate, they normally appeal to authentic recitings like Ibn Kathir and Bukhari and so on and so forth. Why is it in this instance here alone, they are repeating the narratives which is mursal? Mursal goes to a tabi'i, not even an authentic report to the Sahaba, with the exception of Ibn Abbas, who was not an eyewitness, by the way. And again, it's too convenient for the Satanic verses to be revealed. Why do I say that? Because at the beginning of Surah Najm, you read, وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْحَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيُ يُوحَىٰ عَلَّمَهُ شَدِيدُ الْقُوَىٰ. He does not speak out of his own. It is not but a wahi, communication to him. So it's highly convenient to believe that at the start of the surah, there's an emphasis that the Prophet will not err. And then midway, you'd have a situation where the Satanic verses are revealed. And so missionaries are basically clutching at straws. It's unthinkable that after announcing at the beginning of the surah that he has not gone astray, and then in the middle of the surah, he's gone astray. It doesn't make sense. And the question I want to ask Samuel is, does this reconstruction make sense? Let's look at the reconstruction of the Satanic verses. Reconstruct A, and this is done by Nikolai Sinai. Consider Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, the third one. These are the high-flying cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for. Are you to have the male and to him the female? That would be a most unjust division. Is man to have everything he wishes for in the present life and the life to come belong to only God? Now, does that make sense? Does it make sense that on the one hand, they are being praised, and on the next, they're being condemned? Or in the opening chapter, consider Lat, Al-Uzza, and the third, Manat, it's sarcastic, cynical recitation of the gods and goddesses. Does that make sense in any capacity whatsoever? Or reconstruction B, consider Lat, Al-Uzza, these are the high-flying cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for. And then it goes on, what are you to have the male and to him the female? In other words, in reconstruction B, you've got the Satanic verses, and then straight 24, 25, is man to have everything he wishes for when the present life and life to come belong to only God? It doesn't make sense, Samuel. That's the point. And I'm telling to missionaries, how do you believe in a narrative where linguistically and contextually the Satanic verses does not make sense when you enter them into the passage? And this is how the Ruwayas narrate the incident of the Satanic verses in relation to what we have. Now, I've got here an oxymoron. For example, the equivalent, equivocation. Donald Trump is a good, honest, and moral man and the greatest president ever. However, he raped pornographic actors and prostitutes and amassed wealth through fraud. The United States will never have such a good president like Donald Trump. Or the ANC is an honest, trustworthy, and legitimate government. It has engaged in 10,000 acts of corruption over the last decade. We need more honest and dedicated governments like the ANC. Now, what does this tell you, folks? This tells you that contextually, the greatest argument is it does not make sense, even on the assumption that the Ruwaya are accurate, which Samuel is appealing to, and I've shown you they're not. Look at this. You can't say they're high-flying cranes. What, are you to have the male and to him the female? That would mean, so you can't praise them and condemn them at the same time. You can't praise them and condemn them at the same time. Nikolai Sinai, the Quranic scholar, makes a question, does any of the hypothetical reconstructions make sense? He says, reconstruction A is clearly contradictory. For verses 21 and 22, if they are to be interpreted in the sense that God does not have female deities, whilst the Quranic verses admit the existence of these deities. Reconstruction B eliminates verses 21 to 22 from the text, doesn't stand up to scrutiny. From the verses that immediately follow the Quranic verses, reconstruction are verses 24, 25, and their castigation upon man. But the scathing denouncement that you find is reconcilable with a conciliatory attitude. So if it is assumed that the Prophet wanted to conciliate with the pagan Quraysh, then why would he condemn them in the outset of the verse? And why would he basically refer to them sarcastically in the verse subsequent or that goes along with the Satanic verses? The reconstruction 1 and 2 is highly unlikely. The contextual analysis of the verses 19 to 20 is something in hadith criticism called istifham qari, derogatory question. Even in English, you don't speak of this when you speak about someone honorable, and I gave the example of Donald Trump. From criticism to praise to criticism, it does not make sense linguistically and contextually, and Samuel has to address this. This is Nikolai Sinai. He's written a book called The Quran, The Historical Critical Introduction, and I urge Samuel to get a copy of this. And he concludes that one must therefore conclude that the Quranic verses are apocryphal, Nikolai Sinai states, and not part of the surah. John Burton, for example, says the same thing. John Burton was a student of John Wansborough, and quoting John Burton, he says it makes sense to accept Burton's explanation that the Quranic incident is a fictitious occasion of revelation, albeit one that proved to be a grave liability for late and theologically conscientious Muslims. John Burton, I urge Samuel to get the copy of his journal, peer-reviewed journal in the Journal of Semitic Studies, 1970, volume 15, number 2, page 265, that there should be no further difficulty in suggesting that those hadiths have absolutely no historical basis. And there did exist a compelling theoretical motif for the invention of these so-called infamous hadiths. If you look at the narratives, is that the examination do not stand up to any kind of scrutiny. Why does not a single companion of the Prophet narrate this incident? None of the reporters contemporary or an eyewitness. Apart from the report being mursal, all the versions suffer from the isnad persons who were considered weak, unreliable, or majhul. There are several breaks or chains in the narrators, which Samuel has already agreed upon, but he sees no problem in relation to this. Not one of the Satanic Verses narratives agree in any material respect. You see, you mentioned reasonable doubt, beyond reasonable doubt, but for a test of beyond reasonable doubt, there cannot be contradictions on material respects. For example, if you have contradictions on the occasion of the incident, the nature of the Prophet's alleged act, the wording of the Satanic Verses, the effect, the sequel, in the occasion, in one instance, it says the Prophet was praying at the Kaaba. In another instance, it says he was praying at the Kaaba along with the companions. Another instance, it says he was talking to the unbelievers. Another instance, it said that the surah had already been revealed, and later the unbelievers came to hear about it. Then you have another instance which says that no, the unbelievers approached the Prophet and asked him to make such concessions in relation to the occasion of the incident. The nature. In one incident, it says that Satan threw the alleged verses in. Another incident, it says the Prophet uttered them because of his wish to deliver the Satanic Verses. Another incident, it says there were notes of interrogation. Another incident, it said that the Prophet uttered them without giving reason. Another incident, it says that Satan himself imitated the Prophet's voice. Another incident, it says that someone from amongst the unbelievers uttered the alleged verses. Now, these are contradictions in the narratives, contradictions in the incident, and contradictions in relation to the reactions. Because in one incident, it says the unbelievers were pleased and prostrated. In another incident, it says Al-Walid ibn Mughira and Abu Uhayya did not prostrate. In another incident, it says all prostrated. In another incident, it says the unbelievers heard the Satanic Verses, but the believers did not hear them. All the versions unanimously show no objection. And Samuel speaks about 37. But in this book, he speaks about 50 in Shahab Ahmad's latest book, which is based on his thesis, more and updated. 50, analyzes 50. And he actually, in fact, shows in the Ruwaya itself how a lot of the Ruwaya narratives are quoted by the individuals themselves in order to show that they're not authentic, meaning the Ruwaya shows, the narrators in the Ruwaya are showing why these cannot be accepted and why they are, in fact, contradictory in many instances. So the important question to determine is, why is not a single report of the Sahaba showing any kind of disgust with regards to polytheism? If 22 verse 52 was revealed in Medina, if the Prophet himself had uttered it, the couplet, and realized it and retracted it, or had an inkling of the Qurayshi leader's maneuver, then why didn't he send word of a warning to the immigrants in Abyssinia? Why did he not inform them about this change? And the reason for the existing of the Satanic Verses, according to many scholars, some would say that it's an odd couplet which the Qurayshi pagans mention, or that the unbelievers created a noise. John Burton, for example, states that it was many traditions. They were not lying, but they were attempting to produce the whole issue of abrogation, to in fact show or supplement the idea of abrogation. And of course, the fact that early exegetes were trying to also copy, for example, the biblical themes of prophethood and the conversion to Islamic models. For example, the idea in an era where Christians furnished proof, for example, of the saint's holiness, obtained tales of satanic temptation and so on, and they wanted to incorporate that within their particular tradition. So the question I need to ask is, what is your agenda? What is a missionary agenda? What is a polemical agenda? Three major Western scholars of the 20th and 21st century, John Burton, being a student of John Wansborough, Angelika Neuwirth, professor of Quranic studies from Freie University in Berlin in Germany, and Nikolai Steiner, professor of Islamic studies at the Oriental Institute at Oxford University, and a fellow of Pembroke College at Oxford University, rejects this. And a growing number of Quranic scholars, for example, I think, and subject to correction, Fred Donner, if you look at the Cambridge Companion to the Quran, you've got people like, for example, Craig Considine, John Esposito as one example. You've got the student of John Esposito, John O'Vall. You've got Yvonne Yazbek Haddad from Georgetown University, and subject to correction, Karen Armstrong. She's not a scholar, but she's a nun, a former nun, that have cast doubt upon the credibility of this particular narrative. why do missionaries stick on this? Why do they stick on this? And so, in conclusion, what you can find is that almost every major Islamic scholar has rejected the Satanic Verses, including Ibn Taymiyyah. You mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't agree with the fact that the Prophet uttered the Satanic Verses. He says there was an interjection by Satan himself, like Ibn Hajar Asqalani. Every major Islamic scholar has rejected the Satanic Verses as a fabrication. Those who accepted it excluded the Prophet's role. Many modern Western scholars have rejected the Satanic Verses as a fabrication based on the lack of credibility, the inadequacy in the narrative. None of the major hadith collections contain this narrative. None. Why not? None of the reporters is contemporary with the Prophet, nor an eyewitness. The Isnad does not go beyond the second generation Tabi'een after the Prophet. The story makes no structural sense according to Nikolai Sinai. I want Samuel to address this. How do you praise the gods on the one hand and then condemn them in the next, or at the outset sarcastically refer to them and then basically praise them? It doesn't make sense. And then immediately rebuked. I mean, if he was to be rebuked and then he changed, what's the significance behind this compromise? Because then the compromise doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And then the story itself makes, which was said to rebuke him, the verses which were said to rebuke him, Samuel just simply glossed over this. 22 verse 52 and 17 verse 73 were revealed almost a decade later. It is incredulous to believe that the verses which were said to repeal the Satanic Verses were revealed a decade later. It were, of course, a scandal. And why, the reason why the followers left paganism was because they condemned the gods, the unjust society of pagan society. Why did they not object to show any kind of disgust to this? The other important point, no extant Satanic verse texts predate the late 2nd or 8th century, 200 years after the Prophet. And the missionaries that have latched onto this ingenious argumentation in order to present this as authentic or to basically preach the gospel, it's an extremely dishonest and a wholly suspect motif to follow. If you're going to preach the gospel, do so honestly. When you cast doubt about the integrity of the Quran or the integrity of the Prophet, do so with some degree of integrity, do so with some degree of honesty. Samuel operates within the polemical discourse. I'm not saying Samuel personally is the guy, but I'm saying the polemical missionary discourse on this makes no structural, historical, chronological, or linguistic sense. But it's presented in the fashion it has, and therefore, I don't know if I have anything to rebut Samuel after this presentation, because there is no substance or basis to the Satanic Verses story. You need to keep up with the latest research. The Quranic text is unimpeachable. Nikolai Sinai, John Burton, John Esposito, many modern-day Western scholars are pointing this particular point. And therefore, Samuel, I'll be interested in seeing what you say in the rebuttal. But it's important. You have to keep up with the latest research on this particular issue, why this is an uncredible and the story has no scientific or legitimate basis. Thank you very much, Rudolph. I hope I'm on time.
Thanks, Yusuf. No worry. I'll give you 3 seconds extra there. No worry.
That was good.
Okay.
That was good timing. I'm improving.
That is, I must say, you're doing well. Yusuf, if you can just take your screen share off. Samuel, you can start with your 12-minute rebuttal, and as soon as you start, I will start your time.
Okay, hold on a second. Could I just, where are we? Okay, is it off? Is it off?
It's off. Samuel, as soon as you start, you've got 12 minutes.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Yusuf, and I'll go through your points across the next 12 minutes. Now, I fully understand that Tabari is a chronicler and not writing those stories. So you were talking about me as saying that I don't understand these things, and you quoted with Tabari saying that he's putting material forward, but if it's shameful for people, then they need to judge it for themselves. I've got Tabari's book here, and the way that he starts the account is that the messenger of God was eager for the welfare of his people, and he wished to effect a reconciliation with them in whatever ways he could. It said that he wanted to find a way to do this, and what happened was what follows. And then he begins to quote all the hadiths. And so, at Tabari, he still makes his own decisions. And when you actually read the way he introduces it, he's not casting doubt over it when you actually read it. He's just saying, here's the situation and here's what it says. And he goes on from there. Now, you were sort of, let me see. I thought I did mention that it's called The Story of the Cranes. So just to correct that there, I'm pretty sure I did mention that. Maybe I didn't. You said, no, it's not in the Quran. Well, of course it's not in the Quran. That's the whole point of the story. As I showed in the hadiths about how Muhammad composed the Quran, within Sahih Bukhari itself, it shows how Muhammad would say a verse, get feedback from people, then edit the verse into its final form. And so what we have in the Quran today is not what was happening at the time. It's what Muhammad finally came to, if we assume that it's all from Muhammad. I'm not going to get into that now. And so this sort of has to do with your references to Surah 17, verse 73 and 22:52, which you say chronologically fit at a different time. And so how could they be part of Surah, how could they come with Surah 53? Well, it could come about for a few different ways, and that is from the very way that the Quran is put together. If we read books like, what's his name, Sayuti's book on the Quran and how the Quran's put together, we read about how when the Quran's being compiled and surahs are being put together, Muhammad is putting verses in at different points. That's just what the hadiths record. That it's not just one surah comes out in one go, it's bits come and then they get put into a complete part at the end. And so that's how those verses could come about. Those verses could have easily come at various times, and then Muhammad's put them together in the way that he wants, in the places that he wants. And that's actually what the books like Sauti's book say Muhammad did. So that actually deals with the chronology problem when we look at how the Quran itself was composed. Now, you mentioned that all the main 6 Sunni collectors of hadiths reject this story and don't include it. And I want to say to you, I agree, and I gave a reason for that, and that is because, as Sahab Ahmed says in his book, and I am up to date, I'm reading his book, I've read his PhD and his other materials, so, you know, I'm reading his material, the same material that you're quoting. He makes it clear that the reason why the latest scholars don't accept it is not because of the worthiness of the hadiths, but because it doesn't fit in with the doctrine that had developed in the 3rd to the 6th century. And across those centuries, the doctrine develops of Allah's protection of the prophets. And so that is the doctrine that everyone believes. And so that's why Bukhari, as I said, Bukhari does refer to the event, and I quoted Bukhari referring to the event, but he edits it down. He has the pagans bowing in prostration when Muhammad reads Surah 53, but he's edited everything out of it that are shameful to Muhammad. And so he's just got that final sanitized version. Now, you asked what method I am using. Well, I'm just using the method of Muslims. And you're really saying that, you know, missionaries have got all these bad motives. Well, what missionaries have done is we've gone and got the oldest books of Muhammad's life. This is Ibn Ishaq's Rasul Allah. We've gone and got that and Ibn Sa'd's book. So this is what missionaries have done. Missionaries have gone to the earliest Islamic materials on Muhammad's life and read them. Now, that's my methodology. And then my methodology is to read Islamic scholars who have studied in great detail. And in fact, Sahab Ahmed probably has studied more than anyone this area. And I've read all of his work. I haven't read his latest one, but I've read all of his others, and which have said the same thing as what you were showing from his book. And so that's my methodology. I'm just using your sources. I'm actually reading your oldest accounts on Muhammad's life. And so, you know, when we look at that, I'm looking at the oldest accounts of Muhammad's life. I'm seeing that there's multiple attestation that the earliest generations of Muslims who began to write up the story of Muhammad's life at that very early period when they're writing it, that they are writing about the Satanic Verses, and multiple people are doing it in all, and it's being transmitted across all the different centers of learning in the Islamic world. Now, that is good evidence. That is good evidence for an event. In fact, I would argue if you're not going to take that, then you've really got nothing in Islam. You've got nothing in any history. In fact, you've made a standard for history in which nothing can be proved. If you can't have the earliest accounts, the earliest independent multiple attestation accounts being accredited across all the different regions, if that's rejected, then you're basically rejecting everything. Now, you spoke about how the Quran talks about how Muhammad could never do this. Now, in one sense, this is just trying to have, you're actually quoting the Quran, which Muhammad has edited into its final form anyway, and so it's not really evidence. But you're saying that the Quran says that Muhammad is genuine. So at the beginning of Surah 53, it says Muhammad doesn't speak out of capriciousness, and therefore he couldn't have done the Satanic verses. But that's what you're trying to prove. We're actually trying to. I don't doubt that Muhammad was preaching monotheism. What I'm saying is that he compromised. He failed. All people fail at some stages, and at this time he failed. It doesn't mean he wasn't preaching it. It doesn't mean he wasn't teaching it, right? You can teach a message and then fail to keep it. So just saying, oh, but that's his message, means he couldn't have done it. Well, that's just to deny human behavior, that people fail to live up to their own standards sometimes. Now, you referred to, I think it was 69, Surah 69 or 60, where it says that, let me just see if I can get it here, where it says that if the apostle were to invent any sayings in our name, we would certainly seize him by the right hand, and then we would have cut his life aorta, his arteries. And so it's Surah 69, verse 44 to 46. And so you say, well, the Quran says that Muhammad couldn't have made something up in Allah's name because the Quran says that if he did, that Allah would cut his aorta, would kill him for doing so. But it's very interesting. If you go to Sahih Bukhari, volume 5, book 59, hadith 713, we read this, and it's about the death of Muhammad. It's narrated by Aisha, and the Prophet, it says, the Prophet in his ailment on which he died used to say, "Oh, Aisha, I can still feel the pain caused by the food I ate at Khaybar. And at this time, I feel as if my aorta is being cut from that poison." So the first thing is, just if the Quran says, well, Muhammad could never do it, that doesn't prove anything anyway. But even if we take the verse you give as evidence, Surah 69, verse 44 to 46, even if we take that as evidence, then it actually proves my point, because when Muhammad died, he said, I feel like my aorta is being cut. And so that part of the Quran is true in how he died. Now, let's keep going through here. You said that the story doesn't make sense. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense. Honestly, it makes perfect sense. And it fits in the history books at a point in history, and they all fit in it at the same point in history, and it has associated around it the same event. So it actually does make sense historically. And to say, how can the verses go from praising to being criticizing and criticizing to praising? Well, that's because, again, you're working with the Quran as it is now, after those verses has been taken out and it's been composed into its final shape. You can't really look at the Quran as it is now and try to draw any conclusions, because Muhammad, as we've seen, tried verses, and if they didn't work, he modified them. And I showed the hadiths for that. Now, I want to come back to Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah absolutely did accept this event, and he's famous for this. And he is a major Islamic scholar. And I've already given the quote to show that. And Sahab Ahmed has written a whole article on this, and you'll see it in my notes if you go back to my original slides where that was. But I just want to point out again what I was doing. So what I've done is I've tried to take the Islamic sources on their own terms. That is, I haven't imposed upon them from some Christian source. I've just gone back and read the earliest accounts on Muhammad's life. And then I've read the scholars who read these accounts. And what they've said is that across all of the early accounts, when they started to write up the story of Muhammad's life, that they all had this story of the Satanic verses in them. And we saw that there is really good basis for this across the sources being early, being written in the biographies, the Sirat, the Tafsir, and the magazine. There are many sources. It's been transmitted across many different across all the main Islamic learning centers, and that there's no reason to reject it. The only reason Muslims reject it is because it doesn't fit into later doctrine. It doesn't fit into this later teaching that the prophets were sinless. But as I've pointed out, we actually do want sinless leaders. And so I can empathize with Muslims who want Muhammad to be the best. They want Muhammad to be sinless. I can understand why you want that. But what I want to say is we cannot look to our leaders, be it Muhammad or any of our other leaders in this world. Our leaders, like us, have a human nature that is sinful and we fail. There is only one man whom God has worked through, the man Jesus Christ. He is the one who has perfected our humanity. He is the perfect king, the perfect Messiah, the perfect priest, the perfect sacrifice. He is the one who offers the true worship to God and perfects our humanity for us. And he is the one that we should put our hope in. Muhammad was like us. He compromised like us, as we all do. But God has given us a better hope in Jesus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samuel. I gave you that 3 seconds back that Yusuf just got Mahala in the previous session. Yusuf, over to you. You're welcome to start. As soon as you start, I'll start your 12 minutes. You're muted, Yusuf. Still muted?
Can you hear me now?
That's perfect.
That's perfect. Okay, I just want to take my headphones off because I can't speak with headphones, unfortunately. All right, just hold on a second. All right.
No problem.
Okay. I just get this clear. I'm just getting my timing correct, so I just want to put that correct. Okay, thank you, Samuel. Again, I'm disappointed that you haven't actually interacted with some of the key issues that I basically dealt with. And I want to go through this quickly. Firstly, you raised the issue of the criterion of embarrassment. Now, this is like, debating Mike Licona or William Lane Craig, criterion of embarrassment in discussing the resurrection narratives and trying to now look at it from the perspective of Satanic Verses, which is a different paradigm and context in which they were purportedly revealed. The principle of embarrassment can only be applied once you know who a person is. And if you look at me, I've demonstrated in the entire debate, the chains regarding the story are broken and they are missing people in the chains. We don't know who these people are. That's what you call mursal. So it's not a question to just simply say that Muslims are rejecting it because they find this uncomfortable. I mean, if they were authentic Sahih narrations, Muslims would go all out of their way to try and provide some sort of apologetic motif to this narrative. But the reality is that the story is mursal. This is what it's called, mursal. And I'm going to ask you, what's your understanding of mursal and the difference between that and Sahih in the context of the Satanic Verses? We don't know if they're Muslims. We don't know if they're non-Muslims. We don't know if they're hypocrites acting as Muslims and purposely spreading lies. So if you are not sure who the people in the missing links are, how can you then apply the principle of embarrassment? I mean, this is a question we need to ask. You can only apply a principle of embarrassment if you know that the person is a trustworthy Muslim who definitely would have no motive to lie and make up something derogatory of the Prophet. And for all we know, the people in the missing link could be known for fabricating narration. So you can't apply the criteria of embarrassment to people who are unknown. You're not sure who the people in the missing link are. You can't confidently go ahead and apply that particular principle to your case. You then basically mentioned about, the issue of the consistency with the Quran, that it's consistent with the Quran. Quran says other prophets also listen to Satan. Adam is said to have been tempted. Well, and then you take an issue with that, and the Quran mentions that, but that's similar to the biblical narrative, with the exception that in the Bible, you find that the woman is blamed for the sin, and male oppression is entrenched in the Bible in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. And the woman, he said, I'll greatly multiply your sorrow, and your conception, in sorrow shall you conceive, and your desire shall be to your husband, he shall rule over you. The Quran repeatedly, on the other hand, says that Allah protected it against the possibility of being tampered, in a general sense. Now, you may argue it's circular, but I've showed you that it's not just simply circular. The alleged interpolation violates the fundamental teaching of the Quran, monotheism, tawheed, and that constituted the offense of shirk. Now, if people followed the Prophet on the basis of monotheism, ask yourself this question: would they not have left him based on this compromise that he was now suddenly making? And the fact that the Quran says he shall no longer forgive. The story is contrary to the specific statements of the Quran, and on that basis, unworthy of any credence. That's not just simply from a Muslim's point of view, but this is something which John Burton himself, in the Journal of Semitic Studies, Nikolai Sinai, Angelica Neuwirth, John Esposito, Karen Armstrong, John O'Wall, all of them point this out. The other issue you basically pointed out about, before I missed the point, you mentioned Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, and he showed the two different translations, the one from Guillaume. Let me put this clear and put it to bed. Ibn Ishaq, at least in the recension of Ibn Hisham, does not contain the Satanic verses. As a fact, does not. You're quoting from Guillaume's work. What Guillaume did in his translation of Ibn Hisham was that he engaged in a reconstruction of Ibn Ishaq by using some of the narratives of Ibn Jarir Tabari. And so if you look, for example, of the narratives of the Satanic verses Ibn Ishaq, the translation by Guillaume, he's got their T, reference from Tabari, coming from Tabari, which is now incorporated in the translation of Ibn Hisham, but it's not in Ibn Hisham. So you're basically arguing from silence that it may at some point have been there based on the fact that there's embarrassing material contained there. You then mentioned that the Satanic verses, essentially considered a standard element of, I've seen in one of your writings, a historical memory of the Muslims, and you stating early works. I've just pointed out to you that that argument is bogus. Ibn Ishaq does not have it. We've got in the translation by Guillaume, who uses Tabari to reconstruct the narrative of what he believes may have been Ibn Ishaq. If you look, you say you've got the latest work by Shahab Ahmed. Shahab, in his latest book, narrates all 50 riwayas. In the PhD back then in 99, he narrates 37. But the narratives which Shahab Ahmed seeks to interrogate are basically ephemeral. Very few texts predate the Ashab al-Hadith's efforts to deny the Satanic verses. And the riwayah in many instances are in fact cited by the specialists who go out to refute them. In other words, there's no standard consistent account. And I showed you those material defects on occasion, on recitation, on the reaction, on the consequence, they contradict. And the question is that since no extant Satanic verses predate the late 8th century, the bulk of Ahmed's analysis, Shahab Ahmed's analysis, concern narratives that may not have existed in written form, but they were collated in the riwayah based on oral tradition. And Shahab Ahmed admits this himself. He concedes the point that the hadith isnads may be anachronistic fabrications if you read the latest book. But because historical and exegetical works were separate fields of cultural production, he essentially argues that they were largely fueled from the Ashab al-Hadith's efforts to counterfeit isnad. So accordingly, the prejudice about the hadith isnad should not be incorporated within the historical exegetical isnad because Satanic verses stories were allegedly transmitted by historians. But and so he's saying that the early historians were innocent of the so-called isnad gains. But you will counter that because historians and the exegetes were busy in their own isnad fabrication. And if you, for example, look at Andreas Gorke's, the Swedish scholar's book on Maghazi literature, where he points out that not just simply hadith scholars, which had a far higher standard, but the historical narratives had a far lesser standard, where, for example, the isnads were tampered with. Shahab Ahmed relies quite extensively, for example, on Harold Motsky's work, where he views the fact that the isnads represent actual parts of narrative transmission. But the reality is that the point is he concedes that there may be anachronistic fabrications that they may have essentially happened. You mentioned the issue of multiple attestation. Well, multiple attestation can only happen when, for example, you've got a number of people viewing a singular event and then giving multiple events. But for example, if Samuel were to tell me something and he tells me I'm Rudolph and I narrate this, that's not multiple attestation. That's simply reproduction. And what you have in many instances are reproduction. So when you, for example, cite Ibn Taymiyyah is going back to the received oral tradition and the narratives that may have existed. But Ibn Taymiyyah makes a clear point. He's saying, also based on the riwayah itself, many of the riwayah, that it was not the prophet. In some of the riwayah, it says it was Satan. And I'll just basically go to it quickly. Time's at a premium. Because I compiled it. If you look at, for example, Riwayah 9 and 10 in relation to Riwayah 8 and Riwayah 26 in relation to Riwayah 25, they're clearly ambiguous as to what the actual content is. Riwayah 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 22, 23, 35, 36, in those riwayahs, it states that the Prophet is not aware of having done anything wrong. If you look at Riwayah 7 and 8, it speaks about the Prophet having been distressed. If you look at Riwayah 14 and 15, it's both transmitted from Az-Zuhri. It basically gives the impression that the Prophet uttered the Satanic verses that was a simple recitation error. The other riwayahs which speak about the fact that the unbelievers recited this and they were heard and it was confused with the narrative of the Prophet. So my question is, what is the exegetical model that you are using to rely upon the Satanic verses as being authentic? And the question I need to ask is, which version are you relying upon? Now, most missionaries, some would argue that if the Quran is satanic, like Robert Moray, he would say that, no, it was actually Satan inspiring the Prophet. Others would say that if the Prophet was untrustworthy, it was the Prophet making it up. My question is, why is there no consistency in missionary tautology when referring to this particular narrative in terms of where exactly basically it comes from? You say it's consistent with Muhammad's desires that inspired the Quran. In all Islamic accounts, the desire to see the Quraysh accept him as a prophet. Again, this is a bogus argument. It's a weak argument, because if it was his desire, you actually find that the persecution of the Quraysh actually increased tenfold during the time after the recitation of the Surah Najm. And secondly, according to the Satanic Verses narratives, he recited the Satanic Verses and then it was apparently abrogated immediately. So the narrative says it was abrogated immediately. And the narrative speak, you mentioned Surah 22 verse 52 and Surah 17, that they were compiled and the Quran came later. No, in actual fact, if you look at the Rawaya narratives, they give the indication that those two verses were meant to rebuke him immediately. Now, the point is that if he had a desire to win over the Quraysh, it doesn't make sense at all on the one hand that he praises the goddesses and on the other hand condemns them. And further, the opening verse speaks disrespectfully about the goddesses. So how can it use that particular Satanic Verses incident to essentially be something that convinces the particular prophet? Was a prophet a human being? I mean, of course he was a human being. Did he make mistakes? Yes, of course. When it came to revelation, he did not. The Quran in Surah 1698 says, when you read the Quran, seek God's protection from Satan, the accursed one. Now, if the Quran was satanically inspired, would Satan tell you that when you read the book, you ask God to protect you from him? I mean, can you see how nonsensical this whole notion makes sense? Surah 2 verse 208, or you believe, do not follow the footsteps of Satan. He's an ardent enemy. So internally, it doesn't make sense in the broad sense, although you could probably argue that circular reasoning. But the point is that the missionary tautology does not essentially follow through. I want to raise the other point that you basically mentioned about the correlation between Jesus and Muhammad. But I mean, if you look at, for example, Jesus, the temptation of Jesus, if Jesus is God, according to the belief, how can temptation be possible? Because we're told in Matthew, Jesus was tempted by the devil. James in chapter 1 verse 13 says God cannot be tempted. So if God cannot be tempted and Jesus is God in the flesh, how can Satan tempt God with anything in the universe when God himself is the owner of everything? Say that God did get tempted. Jesus did get tempted. Now, if you're arguing that Jesus was a human being, then God had no idea he was God. And at that stage when Jesus was being tempted, did God suffer temporary amnesia? I mean, what was the time when he regained his memory? But can you see how ludicrous this whole thing basically operates? So coming back to the whole point, Samuel, and I think I've got just a few minutes or 1 minute left, is that there are a dozen varying versions. Each version has a different chain of narrations. These incidents have been critically examined by both classical and modern scholars, Western scholars, all agree that each version is technically mursal. It goes to a second generation tabi'i. Another narrator, Ibn Qalbi, for example, is relied generally as an unreliable reporter of hadiths. And you cannot get across this particular point that structurally the Satanic Verses makes no particular sense. If there was any form of credence, it would have created a major scandal amongst the contemporaries in the time of the Prophet. Why did it not? That's a question which hasn't been answered. And therefore, I'm not saying that you have an agenda, but the agenda is basically essentially from the framework in which you're operating from. If many modern Western scholars have rejected the Satanic Verses of fabrication on the basis of lack of credibility, inadequacy in the narrative, what is your purpose for relying on this? Your purpose is basically to show that the Prophet is not valid, he's not sound, he can fabricate, and on that basis, we need to turn to the gospel. But I'm saying that's a very bad, weak way in terms of which you basically operate this narrative. And so there's nothing in substance, in conclusion, in which Samuel said that rebuts anything that I've said. I apologize for the noise. We've got a thunderstorm happening here. So I hope I'm quite clear in my communications to you. I think my time is up, Samuel. Thank you.
It's up. You're absolutely right. It is up. Okay, now for the 15-minute cross-examination. I think I discussed with Samuel beforehand, Yusuf, that you're going to cross-examine Samuel first, and then over to Samuel, then again to cross-examine you for 15 minutes. Let me just say, please remember, question, and please, if you can, a 2-minute answer. Otherwise, we are only going to get in to 3 questions, probably, if you take 5 minutes to answer it. So please, if you can, keep your answers short. I know it's a technical discussion, but if you could do so, that will help the conversation to move on a little bit better. So, Yusuf, over to you. You are welcome to ask your questions to Samuel.
Rob, just quickly, my sound, there's a big noise, there's a big storm here. Am I coming out clear, or is there interference? Because there's a slight interference from your side. Okay.
You're fine.
Are we ready to go?
You can go.
Okay. Samuel, I want to be as quick as possible. The first issue, the prelude to my question, is that if you look at many scholars, more particularly Mufti Muhammad Abdu, he says linguistically, the Satanic verses make no sense because, as a compromise, because the word Quranic, which is trains, has never been used in pre-Islamic poetry to refer to the idols. That this incident would be the first time it's found in the story. Now, the question I need to ask is that if the devil if the devil wanted to fool the pagans, or the prophet wanted to compromise, why would he choose a word they did not ordinarily recognize in referring to deities which they would basically venerate and worship?
Well, I guess I just don't accept the conclusions of that research, because if that is the case, that the high-flying cranes, the Quranic, if that is the first reference of the word that we find in the Islamic literature, well, it just is. I mean, the first reference of a word has to be at some point. And so if that's the first reference of the word, that's it. Just because we may not have it in pre-Islamic poetry, which is fairly scant, this is the first appearance. I just don't see that as being an argument against it.
Yeah, but do you not see a problem with this? Because on the one hand, people are arguing that the Satanic verses was a form of a historical compromise. Now, when you use the word Quranic in reference to the idols, a term which was not used, I'm using a term to praise you, which is unheard of in your vocabulary or your motif or your understanding in praising the idols for that particular matter. It doesn't actually make sense. Why would he choose a word, or why would Satan want to fool the pagans with a word that they would not ordinarily recognize? Can you see the problem that we have in that particular notion?
Well, I'm saying that they may well have known it, and I don't see. It's an argument from silence that they didn't know it, right? It's an argument from silence.
Can you show me a single pre-Islamic poetic work that you're aware of, including the Mu'allaqat, where the idols were referred to as Quranic?
Yeah. I don't need to, because there just needs to be, like, the first reference is what we have here, and this is just the first reference. That doesn't mean that it's not genuine. It was obviously understood by the people of the late first century, amongst the Muslims of the late first century, who were writing these things down. So it's within that first century, the word is definitely understood by the people in Mecca and Medina. So I just don't see a problem here.
That particular point, you don't have any evidence to show that the Quranic was used by the pagans, correct? You've got no evidence on you right now.
Well, it's an argument from silence. So, I've got the evidence that it was understood.
But the argument from silence is on your part, because you cannot basically present. I'm not appealing to the Satanic verses story. You're appealing to it. I'm not. So the argument from silence is on your part, not on mine.
Sorry, the argument from silence is not on my part, because I'm saying that the word is being used in the late first century, and the Muslims understand it. The people in those regions where Muhammad was understood that word. And so, no, you're making the argument from silence, not me.
Okay, so then can you at least agree to this point that all the narratives that we have on the Satanic verses, the riwayah, do not predate the late 8th century?
The late 8th century.
That's 8th century, 2nd century from the Islamic. Do you have any narratives earlier than that?
Well, the narratives are coming from books like Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Sa'd, as I said, and the whole range of the other ones that are put out in Sahab Ahmed's book. Now, he says, and I gave those quotes, that at the beginning of the writing of the history of Islam, and the biographies of Muhammad's life, the magazines of his life, of the first lots of tafsir, that the Satanic verses are in those. So but that's just what the expert says. He says it's in the first writings of the Islamic histories.
Which date to the 8th century, 200 years after the Prophet. The reality is it's about 200 years. Do you agree that missionaries and people who rely on this are relying on scattered texts that date 200 years after the Prophet? That's all I want to know from you.
No, Ibn Ishaq's not 200 years after Muhammad.
The recension of Ibn Hisham is 200 years later.
Yeah. Yes.
We've got the recension of Ibn Hisham. That's 200 years later.
Yes.
So you're relying on, and Ibn Hisham does not contain the Satanic Verses. Jom translates the Satanic Verses based on the reconstruction of Tabari.
Yes, but Tabari says, I got this from Ibn Ishaq, right? And so it's completely, it's a false argument of yours to say that it's an argument from silence. At-Tabari was very careful in what he recorded, and as you said, he's a chronicler, and he would say where he got his information from. And he said he got it from Ibn Ishaq. Now, Ibn Hisham, as I pointed out, takes the Satanic Verses out, and he says why. He says anything dishonoring the Prophet, I'm going to take out. But what I'm saying is we've got to go back to the earliest accounts, and when we do, this is what we find.
But the point is, again, you agree with me, coming back that the earliest reports date 200 years after the Prophet.
No, Ibn Ishaq is before that. Ibn Sa'd is
but we don't have any material. We don't have any material. Even Ibn Ishaq. But I'm going to come. But you see, this goes back to the issue. Do you know the difference between a mursal report and one that is sahih?
Well, isn't a mursal report doesn't have the first link in the chain between Muhammad and the others? Is that correct? The
mursal report. A mursal report, just to teach, well, not only you, but missionaries out there or people out there, to viewers, is a mursal report goes back to a tabi'i or a tabi'i, meaning it doesn't go back to a companion. Sahih goes back to the Prophet, and if a chain basically goes to a companion, doesn't necessarily go back to a Prophet. But in this instance, you don't have a single report going back to an eyewitness companion of the Prophet. They're all tabi'is, and they scattered narratives. Do you agree with that that's a problem that we have at this particular juncture?
Well, that is certainly an aspect of what's happening. But I brought this up in my presentation, that because we have independent transmissions of the story, that takes us back to a common ancestor of the actual event. And so, as I said, chains may be missing links here or there, but when you've got many, many chains passing on the same information, that guarantees that even though there might be a missing link in a chain, that they're going back, because you've got independent chains going back, and they can't be saying this. Yeah, that they can't be saying the same thing if those chains aren't valid, right? They have to be saying.
But the point is, Samuel, the chains are broken. All the chains are broken. Every one of them are broken. But besides that, they're not saying the same thing. That's the point. They're not exactly saying the same thing. One says that the Prophet recited it. One says through interrogation. I mean, I've shown you all the contradictions. Just going to take time to go through it. But they are all contradictory. Do you agree with me that the narratives are not standard? They're all contradictory. And some of the riwayas which Shahab Ahmed notes, he basically points out the fact that they are contradictory, and there may be, he speculates that there could possibly be anachronistic fabrications of the isnads. Now, why do you not, for example, consider that at the very least? Why you're taking an absolutist approach but not consider that?
Well, because in preparation for this debate, I read the 37 accounts or matans that he gives. All right, I gave the 37 accounts, and I want to say they are highly similar. The types of differences they have between them are what you would expect from different eyewitness accounts or different interpretations that have been added onto the events as the message has been passed along, where different people would try to exegete it in different ways. And as I showed with Imam Bukhari, okay.
Even if they and this is the problem that I have, because Nikolai, here's the issue, and we need to move on. Nikolai Sinai, John Burton, Angelic Birth, Esposito, for example, John of Vol, and a few others, modern-day Western scholars would have no necessary motif to or historical bias in analysis. My question to you is, why have you, or why have others, why have Christians, for example, missionaries for that particular matter, not considered their historical work and some of the more later research? Nikolai Sinai, he's got studies on this dating to 2017, 2018. Shahab Ahmed is late. His latest book, based on his biography for his thesis from 99, was earlier than his. Why have you not considered some of the more modern Western scholars who have looked at this and critiqued it and said that historically, chronologically, and in terms of credibility, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny?
Well, but because of the reasons that I actually gave, remember when I said, no, but hang on, I looked at the 5 reasons that the study Quran gives, which are basically the reasons you were just saying then. And when I've gone through them, I just don't find them convincing. I sat down, I read the 37 different accounts, and so I don't find them contradictory. I find them having the normal type of differences of eyewitness accounts and the different types of exegetical things that would go in there. I go back to the original oldest sources. I see that this is what we want people to do with Christianity, to go back to the oldest sources of Jesus.
Quickly, Samuel, just quickly. So you are saying that the Satanic verse is authentic beyond reasonable doubt. My question to you then, just to give you an example, how did it happen? How did the Satanic verses happen?
Okay, well, Muhammad is in Mecca, and he's trying to win over the Meccans, and they're not responding to him, and he's adapting. But now
the question is, but the question is, which narrative are you accepting? Which riwayah are you appealing to? Which riwayah? There are 50 riwayahs, not 37. There are 50. My question is, which of the 50 riwayahs are you appealing to bolster the credibility for the Satanic verses? Which one?
Well, I'm looking. You just said there's 50. I'm saying that's pretty good. If you've got 50 traditions being passed on at that event.
But the 50 are contradictory. Samuel, the 50 are contradictory. That's the point. I mean, was he talking to the unbelievers? Was he talking to his companions? Was it someone else that mentioned it? Was it Satan? Was the prophet approached by the unbelievers to make the concession?
Can I answer that?
Which one is it? Yeah, which one is it?
Yeah, well, when you read them, you get different aspects. First of all, they're highly similar, right? You can't get away from the fact that they're highly similar. There are differences in detail, but that's what I would expect from different independent historical accounts. I'm not expecting independent historical accounts to be identical. I'm expecting them to pick up different amounts. These complement each other. They're not contradictory. And so I just find...
What's the source? But if you say independent, hang on, Sam. If you say independent and you looked at the criterion of embarrassment, you've got the riwayahs, but who's the source? That's a question. Who is the source for this? Do you know the source?
Well, I'm just going by...
You don't know the source.
I'm just going from Shahab Ahmed's work, who actually details out his independent works.
But what Shahab Ahmed does is that he lists all the 50 riwayahs, but at the end of the day, he speculates and concedes that they can't... I mean, these are just narratives circulating around post 200 years after the event. We don't have a source for this.
No, that's not what he says.
We don't have a source. That's not what he says. He speculates. He says that in all probability, they've got a different standard compared to the Ashab al-Hadith in terms of the Isnad narratives and the criteria, but they could be anachronistic fabrications. He admits that at the very least. But I mean, I want to go on because time's running out. Surah 53, okay. I'll bring the code. I urge you to get a copy of this book.
Sorry, guys, just hold on.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys, just hold on. Yusuf, it just makes for terrible viewing on YouTube if you speak over each other. So just allow each other to answer. So you post the question to Samuel. I just paused the time, and you still have a lot of time. So let him just answer. Otherwise, it just sounds a bit flustered and rushed. Thanks, guys.
How much time do I have, Rudolph?
You've got 2 minutes.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Let me just go through this. There's 2 issues which I want you to deal with. One, the chronology. The riwayahs make mention of the fact that Surah 22:52 and Surah 17 verse 73 were revealed to rebuke the Prophet. The riwayahs do mention that. But historically, all scholars mention that it dates at least 8 years later, sometimes in the first year of Hijrah. Now, taking that into account and taking, for example, the reconstruction that was done by Nikolai Sinai, for example, based on the fact that the reconstructions don't make sense, can you for certainty say, in view of the doubts that I have already cast, based on the so-called hypothetical reconstructions and the chronological incredulity, can you, without reasonable doubt, state that there may be possibly a doubt on these narratives from your side, not from mine? I'm saying it's doubtful beyond reasonable doubt. Are you allowed to speculate? Are you prepared to concede that there may be a doubt?
Well, that depends on how I understand Surah 17, what was it? Surah 17 and chapter Surah 22. I can't remember the exact verses now.
Yeah.
Now
22:52.
What we find when we read the hadiths, and we find this in Bukhari and elsewhere, is that when there's an event, as that story is passed on, often the Muslims who are passing the story on exegete that story. They exegete it by putting in verses from the Quran to explain it. And you find that I quoted one of Aisha referring to Surah 33, verse 51, where it has the verse and then it has Aisha saying it, and it's a type of exegesis. And so verses are put in, and so that's what I see happening, and that's what Shahab Ahmed says.
But some of the riwayas, quickly.
The exegetes put these verses in to explain the story, and they may come from elsewhere in the Quran.
Well, just quickly, some of the riwayas state that those verses were revealed immediately after. Chronologically, it cannot make sense. But the reconstruction, what do you say about the reconstruction? How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that the reconstruction makes no sense?
Well, I'm saying that the reconstruction does make sense, because what we have here is an event that Muslims are trying to explain, and they're explaining it over time. The riwayas, the transmissions may differ as Muslims try to explain this.
But the praise and the condemnation, the praise and the condemnation, how do you explain the praise on the one hand, condemnation, praise, condemnation, linguistically?
Sorry, time's up.
Okay.
Sorry, yes. Okay. Listen, I was a bit flustered, I'll be honest, but Samuel, over to you, 15 minutes to cross-examine yourself.
All right. Thank you for that, and for the opportunity now to ask some questions. Now, as I pointed out, because in the chain of narration for the Quran that people use, the Hafs translation, Hafs is counted as unreliable by Imam Muslim. Now, if he's unreliable, it just seems to me that you're using two different standards. You know, you want to be critical of the chains of the Satanic Verses, but when it comes to the Quran, and there's an unreliable man who's counted unreliable by Imam Muslim, but you're still going to accept his transmission. So just your comments on that.
Okay, so firstly, just quickly, the writer doesn't say that Hafs is unreliable insofar as a chain of transmission pertaining to the Quran itself is concerned. He speaks about him as unreliable in a general sense, looking at the quotation you gave. Secondly, even on the assumption that he was unreliable, which doesn't make sense, on the basis of the transmission of the Quran, you've got other Qurans, for example, in North Africa. If you were to go to Morocco, unfortunately, I didn't bring it yet. I didn't know we were going to do this. You look at the Warsh Quran, with the exception, for example, of certain variations in terms of pronunciations and probably terms or the inclusion of the alif, the standard recitation for the Warsh is identical to almost a letter compared to the Hafs. So I think the condemnation or the critique against him was in his capacity as a person being unreliable. But as I understand, there was no direct attack against him in his capacity insofar as the transmission pertaining to the Quran is concerned. And even if the attack was there in the very first instance, it makes no difference, because you can have the Hafs Quran and you can compare it to the Warsh and see if there's any significant differentiation between the two texts, or any, for example, ones, Qalun for that particular matter, or Ibn Kathir.
Well, I mean, they're not identical, obviously.
Well, I mean, they're not identical, but in a general sense, they're the same thing. I mean, Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen, Malik Yawmiddin,
yes.
That they're the same. And so the point is, what I see is that he's been attacked on the basis of him as a person. Now, in relation to Satanic Verses, and I think you're trying to create an equivocation, we're not simply attacking them on the basis of the credibility of them as individuals. We're going to the root source and attacking the narratives itself. The narratives basically are contradictory in terms of the nature of the act, contradictory in terms of the occasion, contradictory in terms of the reaction to the Satanic Verses. So the narratives themselves are also, and the isnad and the chain is not and we don't know who the narrators are. We don't know who the source is. We know who Hafs is. We don't know what the source of the Satanic Verses is. So it's not the same thing. You can't create an equivocation. You can't create an equivocation between the two.
Okay. Well, obviously, I feel that if a man's unreliable, if a man's counted as unreliable, that's his character. Anyway, we'll move on from there.
Okay, but let's assume it is.
Okay. Yeah. I quoted a hadith in which Muhammad recited Surah 4, verse 95, and he said, "Not equal are those who sit to those who go out and fight in Allah's cause." And then we saw how was it Amir bin Maktab said, "What about me?" And then the verse changed. And then it said, then Allah revealed, that not equal to those who sit and don't go out to, except if they're disabled, to those who go out and fight for Allah. Now, it seems to me that when I'm looking at that Muhammad is just composing it. He's saying a verse, he sees that there's a problem with the verse, and so then he modifies it. And so, you know, it looks like that's exactly what's happening with the Satanic Verses, that Muhammad is saying these verses, if they work, good. If they need to be modified, good. And that's in Sahih Bukhari. And there are several examples of that. Your comments on that, please.
Well, there's two issues. One, in relation to Surah 4, verse 95. The problem is that the Quran was contextual. In other words, if you look at the Asbabun Nuzul, the cause of revelation, it was revealed in the context of events that were happening in the life of the Prophet. That could possibly be one explanation in relation to Surah 4, verse 95. But more particularly, and I would urge you to get this specific book called Authentication of Hadith, Redefining the Criteria by Israr Ahmad Khan, who is a Hadith scholar. And what he points out is that more often than not, you have things which are called, loosely speaking, vaticinium ex eventu, prophecies after the event or incidents after the event, where, for example, you've got a Quranic narrative or a Quranic verse, and later on you've got a particular hadith narrative which seeks to provide some degree of explanation in terms of how that specific verse came about or what was the historical context and background of that particular verse. And then it is foisted backwards based on that particular narrative itself. And that's what he argues and speculates in, for example, passages like Surah 4, verse 95, or other passages in the Quran. For example, some would argue Surah 9, verse 29, or Surah 9, verse 5, and so on and so forth. So he argues that these were the hadith writers or the oral tradition that were passing on. They were making certain attempts in terms of explaining the historical background of this particular passage or this narrative. And they tried to foster the idea that whenever the Prophet needed revelation or whenever it became a necessity or an incident basically occurred, then historically speaking, a revelation came to him. So the basis for the hadith was not to simply go and show or illustrate that the Prophet was making up revelation conveniently, but the basis of the hadith was an attempt by the hadith writer or the transmitter to try and give an indication that revelation would come so easily to the Prophet. And on that basis, Israr Ahmad Khan argues that it's possible that those hadiths are later fabrications. But based on that, if you're now trying to create an equivocation with the Satanic Verses, Verses make no sense because,
Sorry, you've just made a big claim there. I've just quoted a Sahih
Bukhari
hadith from Bukhari, which showed that Muhammad recited a verse one way, and then he recited it, and then after getting feedback from people, he recited it another way. And you're saying that that is just an invented story and it's not real.
That's what Israr Ahmad Khan alludes to, and what many hadith. You know, when you speak about Sahih in relation to Bukhari, Sahih, for example, in relation to the other collections of the Sihah Sitta. For example, in Bukhari itself, you'd have a situation of monkeys being stoned for committing adultery. You have a situation where Moses runs naked in front of his community and takes a bath. You have issues where Solomon, for example, has sex with 100 women in one. There are a lot of questionable material, even in Bukhari itself. And what the argument being presented is that not a lot of the material have to be examined and have to obviously be critically analyzed in light of this particular Quranic narrative. Now, the point I'm making is that the hadith is very convenient in terms of wanting to explain how revelation happened. And I think the point you're trying to emphasize is that in a similar fashion, that's how the Satanic Verses happened. The problem we have is that there is no inkling of a trace of the Satanic Verses in the Quran or in the hadith literature for you to reach that particular conclusion. So the problem we have is that if there was a historical compromise, then the historical compromise was inconsequential, because on the one hand, there is a historical compromise, and in the next hand, there is a condemnation. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, okay, hang on. Can I ask you? You're talking for long periods here.
Okay.
And I've got questions I want to get through. Now, from what you were just saying about Bukhari, and in your rebuttal of me, you said none of the six main collectors of hadiths, of the Sahih hadiths, have the Satanic Verses. Now, first of all, that's not true. I showed Bukhari's Bukhari's retelling of the story, because he retells how Muhammad
doesn't contain it. It doesn't contain it.
He talks about Muhammad reciting Surah 53 and the pagans falling down and bowing. It's just everything else is stripped away. So what else is that referring to?
Well, why would he strip it away? I don't want to question you, but the rhetorical question: why would he strip it away? Was he embarrassed?
Yeah, well, yes, for the reason that I pointed out that, for the reasons that I pointed out with Ibn Hisham, where Ibn Hisham said he's not going to pass on something that's not reliable. But hang on, I want to come down on what you were just saying on Bukhari, because you were saying to me that Bukhari's got these fabrications and all these things in it. But Bukhari
well, does it have it? I mean, does it have, for example, Moses running naked in the community, volume 1, hadith number 277, or volume 4, hadith number 74? Does it have that or not?
Let me finish. You're the one saying this. Bukhari has impeccable chains. Bukhari is the one who goes through and gets all the perfect chains. And then what I'm saying now is, in Bukhari, you've got perfect chains, but you're now rejecting. Let me finish.
Not all.
Yeah, for most Muslims, Bukhari is there because he checked all the chains and he didn't let anything in that didn't have a good chain. But you're now rejecting it because it doesn't seem suitable to what you believe. And that's exactly what I'm saying.
I think, Samuel, you're missing the point. I said in a general sense, Bukhari has impeccable chains, but you also have to look at the criteria of the matan, which is the actual text itself. Now, if you, for example, look at the story of the monkeys committing adultery, you're probably familiar with that, where monkeys were stoned. It's a pre-Islamic incident during the days of Jahiliyyah that doesn't have an impeccable chain. It only goes back to a Sahabi, but in fact, it's a questionable chain. The isnad is questionable. So in a general sense, Bukhari has a stronger chain. But in certain respects, not every single hadith. So you'd probably have 90%. You'd have 10% or maybe 80%, for example, of Bukhari having impeccable chains. You've got another 20% that doesn't. So in a general sense, but I'm saying that the Maghazi literature and the historical material have absolutely no chain. They are mursal. They are basically by the tabi'i. They don't even go back to a companion. So you can't compare a report that goes to the companion with a report that goes to a tabi'i. It's not the same thing. You're comparing pork and cheese. You're comparing apples and oranges.
Okay, now my last point is you quoted to me Surah 69, in which it said that if Muhammad made anything up, Allah would cut his artery. And then I quoted from Bukhari, where it said that that's what happened to him, that he was going, my artery's hurting. I just, how do you view that in Bukhari?
Well, I can give you the quotation, the translation by Muhammad Asad, and the actual verses in Surah Muhammad, verse 19, Surah 47, verse 19. فَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَاسْتَغْفِرُوا لِذَنْبِكَ وَلِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ مُتَقَلَّبَكُمْ مَثْوَاكُمْ. And then it basically says, so know that there is no God but Allah, and ask protection for thy sin and for the believing men and the believing women. And Allah knows you're moving about and you're staying in place. What the translator states here is that the Prophet himself and every believer is told to keep praying to Allah for being protected from sins, protection from sins for himself and for all the believers, men as well as women. So it says, ask protection for thy sin and ask protection from sin, from that's committing sin.
Sorry, but that's not the verse I was talking about.
It's Surah 47, verse 19. So there is no God.
No. I was talking. I was speaking about Surah 69 and about Allah.
Sorry, hold on a second. Let me turn.
I was speaking about a different verse. Anyway, that's our time. That's our time.
If Rudolph wants to give us an extension of time, I'd be happy to answer that.
Yeah. No.
69 verse. Okay. Sorry about that.
No worry.
That's all right.
Okay,
guys.
Okay.
Just for the listeners. Sorry, guys. Just for the listeners online, again. If you would like to access any information of the speakers, you're welcome for Samuel Green to go to www.engagingislam.org. And then for Yusuf Ismail, you're welcome to go to www.ipci.co.za. Okay, guys, I'm going to give you 3 minutes each to do your closing statements. And Yusuf, you'll go first. As soon as you start,
no questions,
I'll start 3 minutes. No.
Are there no questions? And there are no questions at all? Okay.
None.
Let me just get myself in order. Hold on a second. Apologize for this.
No problem.
I just want to put my time. How many? It's 3 minutes, right? Just give me a second.
That's correct.
I'm trying to get this. Hold on. I'm just putting my timer on, so I'm not too long or too short. Sorry about this. Okay, well, thank you, Samuel. I really appreciate you coming here on this program because I thought this was ideal for me to go and basically break down some of these narratives and the stereotypes that go on. And I think I have basically proven my case in showing that there is significant doubt on the Satanic Verses narratives. The hermeneutical issues that involve in the Satanic Verses incident are not dealt with missionaries. The point at the end of the day is there is no authentic version of the Qissat al-Quranic. Every version in Tabari and Waqidi is categorized as weak. None go back to the Prophet or a companion for the matter. The strongest goes back to a Tabi'i. Even Ibn Hajar Asqalani, the commentator for Bukhari, and Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, admits this. They admit this themselves. And Ibn Taymiyyah, when he narrates the Satanic Verses, he says there's no power on the Prophet. The Prophet never recited the verses. He's arguing that it's Satan that's interjected. A lot of the riwayas which Samuel and missionaries rely upon state that in certain instances the unbelievers heard this and people believed, and they're not basically accurate. So even if we forget the isnad analysis, if you look at the story itself, there are so many versions of it. One version said that the Prophet was sleepy and he messed up. Another version said that he was in Salah in the Kaaba when reciting. Another version said that he was sitting in the gathering reciting. Another said that Satan interjected and the Prophet had no part to play. Other versions of the Satanic Verses stories destroy the conclusion of missionaries and, of course, the argumentation. So what objective scientific and historical methodology are they utilizing for insisting that their version of the story is correct? Imam Razi, Ibn Khuzaymah, Ibn Hazm, Ibn Hajar, Imam Muslim, Ibn Salah, none of them accept this. The contextual analysis of the verses, verse 19 to 20, showed that what will follow will be criticism because of the concept of istifham qari, derogatory question. In English, I can't say Samuel is a good man, which he indeed is, and Rudolph is a good man, but they murdered 2,000 people in South Africa. They remain the best people. It doesn't make sense. It's like an oxymoron. Muhammad Abdu pointed out that linguistically, it makes no sense because the Quranic was never used in pre-Islamic poetry. Nikolai Sinai, John Burton, Angelica Neuwirth have stated from a scholarly point of view that the Satanic Verses make absolutely was a fabrication. So why are missionaries and polemicists, why have they not kept up with the latest research? Why have they not even looked at Shahab Ahmad, who says that the Satanic Verses may be anachronistic fabrications? And lastly, the Satanic Verses violates the Quran at a fundamental level. The Quran says polytheism is the highest form of sin. It says there's no compromise, makes no logical sin. The Quran speaks repeatedly against Satan and being influenced against satanic inclinations. When you read the Quran, it says, seek refuge in Allah from Satan, the accursed one. There's a touchstone of theology in the Quran which says, Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Says Allah, God the one and only, God the eternal, the absolute. He does not beget, nor is he begotten, and there is no one like unto him. You believe in one God, not a trinity, not a triumurti, not Jesus is God, the one and only God that there is, Allah. And so I say that from a Christian point of view, there is no comeback in relation to the overwhelming evidence against the credibility of the Satanic Verses. And thank you for that, Samuel. You've been a gentleman in both of our meetings. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Samuel, as soon as you start, I'm going to give you 3 minutes for your closing.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for sticking with the debate. I hope that you found it helpful. Yusuf and I have had lively discussion here, and I think that's really good that we can do that because these things are important to us. And when we discuss it and it's important, sometimes we get animated, and that's okay because we do care for each other. And I consider Yusuf my friend, and I hope when I go to South Africa, we'll be able to meet face to face. I want to thank Rudolph for organising this, and as I said, for Yusuf for being part of it and suggesting the topic. I just want to give a summary of what I said again and some concluding statements. First of all, I looked at the historical basis for the event, and I saw, and I pointed out from the Islamic scholars that when Islam started to write up its history at the end of the 1st century, when those first scholars were writing up their histories, the Satanic Verses was right there in the Sirat literature and in the magazine literature and in the Tafsir. The event is right there. We saw that it's attested to from the very beginning. It has multiple sources, so it's not just coming from one person or one source, but from multiple sources. And there are differences between these as they go on, as they get transmitted through the times, but they are multiple sources. We saw that that all of the major Islamic centers of learning taught this in those early centuries. And in fact, it was a standard part, as the Islamic scholars say, of how Muslims were retelling the life of Muhammad in the first 2 centuries of Islam. Now, it's true that it's not in Bukhari and Muslim and those hadith collections, but as I pointed out, this is because by their time, the doctrine of the protection of the prophets had become the standard orthodoxy. And so hadiths, as Yusuf has pointed out, hadiths and stories about Muhammad are not just accepted on the basis of their chains, they're also accepted on, is the story acceptable? And as I showed, by the 3rd to the 6th century, the doctrine of the infallibility of the prophets had meant that the Satanic Verses was now unacceptable. And so by the time you get to the hadith collectors, they don't include it, although I did show a version from Bukhari where he did have something there. I went through the reasons that people reject it and showed that there's really no basis there. And Yusuf ended up defending this by saying that Bukhari's got lots of false things in it. But ultimately, I wanted to say that the person we need to put our hope in is Jesus. He is the one who hasn't compromised. He is the one that you can read the oldest sources of his life and find out who he truly is, and that's what I recommend you do. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Samuel. Well, thank you, guys. Obviously, this is always such a pleasure to listen to both of you, and it's always such a pleasure to facilitate these conversations. And, I just realized once more that we need to talk a lot more and listen a lot more to each other. But thank you so much for just the absolute time that you've taken. We had a bit of technical difficulties. Obviously, we had challenges with load shedding in South Africa, and Samuel just stuck around. So Samuel, thank you for just your patience on that as well. But maybe this can open up the conversation, maybe for future discussions as well. I know that some of the concerns amongst Christians globally is that we are covering the same topics over and over again. It's always about the Trinity, and it's always about Christian topics at hand, and Christians are always on the back foot. But, we showed today that, it's reasonable and it's even possible for us to have conversations on both sides, which is deemed to be a bit controversial. And so we will pursue and keep on doing this. Again, thank you for the listeners. We had a few individuals that listened online, listened on YouTube, and it was actually quite necessary for us to go through that. Sorry, we didn't get to your questions. We just had a challenge, and there's a possibility for load shedding to take place from 12. So we really just wanted to wrap it up and get the conversations and the comments and the arguments in. But if you have any further questions, you are welcome to engage with the scholars, and you're welcome to engage with every individual speaker on their web pages as well. You're welcome to email them as well. And hopefully we will have other discussions as well. And looking forward to those. And guys, thank you once more for your time. Yusuf, thank you for going today, which is a Saturday. And Samuel, thank you for yourself as well. And we will definitely do this again. Samuel, hopefully in the near future, you can come to South Africa. You will really love South Africa. And it will be wonderful to take you around and to show you everything around this side as well. But thank you to everybody online. Thank you to your speakers. And thank you as well for the persons that are always doing the work behind the scenes, to Ahmed, that in actual fact allowed for us to run this smoothly without technical glitches. It's only successful because of the individuals that are working in the background. So thank you to you guys as well. Obviously, thanks to Adila as well for always helping, arranging everything. She's an absolute brilliant star. And thanks to her as well, Yusuf. And speak to you guys again and have a lovely Saturday. We're going to have a braai now, even though it's winter and the wind is blowing. We're going to put some firewood together and we're going to have a good braai. So enjoy, guys, and speak with you again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Rudolph. You've been generous. You've been a fantastic moderator. Really appreciate that.
Thank you, Rudolph. Yes.
You're welcome.